For a soldier like Klaus, the world was built on certainties as solid and unyielding as the concrete of the West Wall. He was a product of a system that championed order, strength, and a clearly defined place for everyone. The Germany he fought for was a nation of rigid, interlocking parts, where every man and every woman had a sacred duty. For the man, it was the battlefield, the factory, the state. His role was to be the sword and shield of the Reich, to project its power outward and defend its borders with his life. It was a heavy burden, but a glorious one, reinforced by years of propaganda that depicted the German soldier as the pinnacle of masculine virtue. His entire existence, from the songs he sang to the newsreels he watched, confirmed this reality. He understood his enemies, the Soviets and the British, through this same lens. They were formidable, yes, but they were men, fighting a war of men. The world, as he knew it, was a grand and brutal contest of male strength, of industrial might wielded by male hands, and of strategic genius conceived in the minds of male generals. It was a worldview that left no room for ambiguity. The role of the German woman in this worldview was just as clear, and in its own way, just as vital. She was the heart of the homeland, the vessel of its future. The doctrine was simple, almost poetic. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Her domain was the hearth. Her duty was to raise strong sons and dutiful daughters, to maintain the cultural and racial purity of the nation. She was to be protected, revered, and kept far from the corrupting influence of industry and war. A German woman behind the wheel of a heavy truck, operating complex machinery, or directing traffic in a bustling city was an image so alien it was simply unthinkable. It would have been a sign of profound national decay, an admission that the men had failed so completely that the natural order had been overturned. This wasn't just a cultural preference, it was a pillar of their ideology. It was proof of their societal health and superiority. The American enemy, by contrast, was depicted as a decadent, chaotic society, corrupted by jazz music, racial mixing, and a dangerous blurring of the roles. But what happens when a soldier, raised on the iron certainty of this worldview, is suddenly forced to confront the reality of the nation he was told was weak? The journey into the heart of America was a disorienting blur of steel and dust. For Klaus and the thousands of other German prisoners packed into freight trains, it was the final, humiliating chapter of their war. Stripped of their weapons, their insignia, and their pride, they rumbled through a landscape that was baffling in its sheer scale. They crossed rivers wider than any they'd seen, past fields of corn and wheat that stretched to the horizon, and saw cities that seemed to glitter with an impossible energy, untouched by the bombs that had pulverized their own homes. The guards were young, almost casual in their duty, chewing gum and reading comic books. It was all part of the psychological assault. They were being shown, not told, the power of the enemy they had underestimated. But the true shock, the one that would lodge in their minds like a piece of shrapnel, wasn't a display of military hardware or industrial might. It was something far smaller, far more mundane, and infinitely more powerful. As their train shuddered to a halt at a rural crossing somewhere in the vast emptiness of the American Midwest, a cloud of dust announced an approaching vehicle. It wasn't a military jeep or a convoy truck. It was a simple, mud-splattered Ford pickup. Through the grime-caked slats of the boxcar, Klaus watched the truck slow to a stop. His mind, conditioned by years of war, automatically assessed the driver. He expected to see a farmer, a grizzled old man, or perhaps a youth too young for the draft. Instead, the person behind the wheel was a woman. She wasn't a uniformed auxiliary or a government official. She wore a simple floral dress, her hair tied back with a scarf. Her arm, tanned and slender, rested casually on the open window. She looked impatient, tapping a rhythm on the steering wheel as she waited for the long, clattering train to pass. She glanced at the POW car, her expression a mixture of mild curiosity and indifference, the way one might look at cattle being transported. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't shocked. She was just a woman, driving a truck, on her way to do whatever it was she did. For Klaus, the image was a short circuit in his brain. It didn't compute. A woman, alone, confidently operating a piece of machinery on an open road. It was a casual act, but it was a more profound symbol of American power than any tank or bomber he had ever seen. A ripple of murmurs spread through the boxcar, heads pressed against the gaps, eyes straining to confirm the impossible sight. It wasn't just Klaus, it was every man. They spoke in hushed, disbelieving tones. They had seen women in uniform, of course. They knew of the female snipers of the Red Army, figures of grotesque, unnatural horror in their propaganda. But this was different. This wasn't a desperate measure born of total war. This was normal. The woman in the truck was not an aberration. She was a feature of the landscape. As the train began to move again, pulling the image away from them, a heavy silence fell. The sight of that lone woman had planted a seed of doubt far more corrosive than any physical defeat. It suggested that their entire understanding of their enemy, and therefore of themselves, was built on a lie. They had been taught they were fighting a soft, decadent nation. But what kind of nation was so powerful, so bottomlessly resourced, that it could afford to let its women drive trucks to the market while its men were fighting a war on the other side of the world? It was the first crack in the foundation of their reality. The destination was a sprawling camp in rural Mississippi, a place named Camp McCain. The air was thick, heavy with humidity and the smell of pine. As Klaus and his fellow prisoners were processed, they were led into an administrative building. The expectation was for stern-faced American officers, for the familiar bureaucracy of a military apparatus run by men. But the sound that greeted them wasn't the bark of orders, but the rhythmic, high-speed clatter of dozens of typewriters. And the hands flying across the keys belonged to women. They were civilians, dressed in modest blouses and skirts, their faces a mask of professional concentration. They processed paperwork, filed documents, and answered ringing telephones with a calm efficiency that was unnerving. One woman, her hair in a neat bun, looked up from her work, caught Klaus's eye for a brief second, and then returned to her typing without a flicker of fear or even hatred. They were just doing a job. The prisoners were not objects of terror or fascination. They were simply a column in a ledger, a piece of administrative work to be completed. This was not the desperate substitution they had imagined. This was an organized, integral part of the American war machine, operating with a placid confidence that felt more intimidating than any armed guard. Days turned into weeks, and the prisoners were put to work, often on local farms to alleviate the labor shortage. It was here that the abstract shock of the woman in the truck became a daily, undeniable reality. Klaus was assigned to a small family farm where the patriarch was a man in his 60s, his two sons away at war. The real authority in the fields was his daughter, a young woman named Sarah, no older than 20. Klaus watched, initially with a sense of condescending pity, as she climbed onto the seat of a hulking John Deere tractor. The pity evaporated the moment she fired up the engine with a deafening roar. She handled the machine with an expertise that was both infuriating and awe-inspiring, ploughing perfect furrows in the dark earth. She taught the prisoners, through gestures and a few simple English words, how to properly load and operate a mechanical hay baler. She had a mechanic's intuition, a farmer's grit, and an authority that came not from a uniform, but from pure competence. This wasn't just driving. This was taming machinery, commanding the land. It was men's work, and she was doing it better than many men Klaus had known. He and the others worked under her direction, their deeply ingrained sense of superiority eroding with every drop of sweat. One afternoon, hauling timber in a truck driven by another prisoner under the watchful eye of a single, elderly guard, they passed a munitions factory on the outskirts of a town. The shift was changing, and a river of humanity poured from its gates. The prisoners fell silent, staring. The vast majority of the workers were women, their faces smudged with grease, their hair tucked into bandanas. They were laughing, chatting, smoking cigarettes, their bodies moving with the weariness and purpose of a hard day's labour. Later that night in the barracks, the men tried to process what they'd seen. They must be desperate, a corporal named Franz insisted. To send their women into the factories, the country must be on the verge of collapse. But Klaus couldn't agree. He remembered the look on their faces. It wasn't desperation. It was something else. They didn't look desperate, Klaus said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. They looked strong. The country isn't collapsing, Franz. It's barely even trying. This is their reserve. We have nothing like this. The argument died in the stifling Mississippi air. The terrible truth was that America wasn't scraping at the bottom of the barrel. It was just getting started, and its barrel was deeper than they could have ever imagined. The most surreal moments were the glimpses of normal life. On a Saturday, while repairing a fence along a public road, Klaus watched the civilian world go by. It was a parade of the impossible. A car full of teenage girls laughing as one of them drove a little unsteadily with the radio blaring. A woman driving a station wagon loaded with groceries and children. A mail truck steered by a woman in a crisp blue and grey uniform who gave them a cheerful wave. Each vehicle was a fresh assault on his sense of reality. In Germany, a civilian vehicle was a rarity. Fuel was rationed to the point of non-existence, and every aspect of life was subjugated to the total war effort. Here, it seemed, a war was being fought somewhere very far away, and while the men were gone, life simply continued. The women hadn't just taken over the essential jobs, they had preserved the very fabric of a peacetime society. This wasn't a nation sacrificing everything for victory. This was a nation so powerful it could fight the largest war in human history and still have enough gasoline for a teenage girl to go for a joyride. It was a display of wealth and normalcy so profound it felt like a deliberate psychological taunt. The turning point for Klaus wasn't a single event, but a slow, dawning comprehension that finally crystallized one evening while he was reading a discarded copy of Life magazine he'd found in a workshop. He couldn't understand all the words, but the pictures told a story that needed no translation. There were pages of photographs showing women welding the hulls of ships, riveting the fuselages of B-17 bombers, and assembling Sherman tanks. And then there was an article with charts and numbers. He struggled through it with a pocket dictionary, but the figures were brutally clear. 6 million women had entered the American workforce since 1941. 1 out of every 3 factory workers was a woman. The article boasted that in the last year alone, American factories, staffed by these women, had produced more aircraft than the entire German Reich had in 5 years. It was at that moment his worldview finally and completely shattered. The woman in the truck, the typists, the farmer's daughter, the factory workers, they weren't anecdotes. They were the cells of a vast industrial organism. They were the secret weapon Germany never knew America had. How do you fight an enemy whose true power was a force you were taught to believe was powerless? The psychological impact was a slow-acting poison. For Klaus, the principles he had mistaken for strengths were revealed as catastrophic weaknesses. The ideology of Kinder, Kirche, once a source of pride, now seemed like a self-inflicted wound. It was a doctrine that had deliberately sidelined 50% of the nation's talent, intelligence, and energy. He began to see the endless Nazi newsreels in his mind not as celebrations of a healthy society, but as propaganda for a foolish one. They had celebrated their women for staying home, while the Americans had been quietly training theirs to build the very bombers that would level German cities. The humiliation was profound. It wasn't just that Germany had been overpowered, it had been outthought. The American enemy wasn't decadent, they were brutally, terrifyingly practical. They had treated the war not as a clash of ideals, but as a massive industrial problem to be solved. And they had used every tool at their disposal, including the hands and minds of their women, to solve it. Germany's rigid, romanticized ideology had been a cage of its own making, and they had only realized it once the cage was burning around them. Klaus's entire concept of strength was being dismantled and rebuilt. He was a product of a system that glorified hardness, the rigid discipline of the goose step, the unyielding steel of a Krupp cannon, the inflexible hierarchies of the state. Strength was brittle. It was meant to break its enemies or be broken. But here in America, he was witnessing a different kind of power. It was the strength of flexibility. It was a fluid, adaptable power that could bend without breaking. A society that could send its men to war and seamlessly fill their roles with women wasn't weak. It was exhibiting a level of social resilience he could barely comprehend. It was the strength of a deep river, not a stone fortress. The American system, which his propaganda had dismissed as chaotic and individualistic, was proving to be far more robust than his own. It could absorb a blow like Pearl Harbor, reorganize its entire economy, and unleash a torrent of production that simply drowned its enemies. He realized his nation's strength was a facade, a beautiful, polished suit of armor with a hollow man inside. America's strength was in its very bloodstream. The moment of absolute clarity came one sweltering afternoon. Klaus was helping the farmer's daughter, Sarah, fix a jammed conveyor belt on a hay loader. His hands were clumsy, unaccustomed to the machinery, while hers were deft and sure, confidently loosening bolts and clearing the obstruction. He watched her, a woman who could likely not even load a rifle, display a mechanical aptitude that would have earned a soldier commendation. Gathering his few words of English, he pointed from her to the machine. "In Germany," he said, struggling to form the sentence. "Women, no machines." He expected a look of pride, or perhaps patriotic fervour. Instead, she paused, wiping grease from her brow with the back of her wrist, and gave him a look of genuine, unvarnished confusion. She didn't seem to understand the statement. "But," she said, as if explaining something to a small child, "how else would the work get done?" That simple, logical question was more devastating than 1,000 bomber raid. It wasn't a boast. It was a reflection of a reality so self-evident to her that his own worldview was not just wrong, but literally incomprehensible. It was in that moment he understood. They hadn't just lost a war, they had lost a contest between two separate centuries. Sarah's question echoed in his mind for days. How else would the work get done? The answer was that in Germany the work wasn't getting done, not on this scale. He suddenly saw the war not from a trench, but from a God's eye view. He pictured the American farmer's daughter fixing her hay loader, and at the exact same moment, a woman in Detroit riveting a bomber wing, and another in California welding a ship's hull. He multiplied that by millions. It was a vast, continent-spanning assembly line, humming with a power his own country had intentionally suppressed. He thought of his sister, Ingrid, who was sharp and resourceful but was destined to be a wife and mother. He thought of his mother, who managed a household with the logistical skill of a quartermaster. What could they have built? What could they have contributed? The Nazi Party had told them that their greatest contribution was their biology. It was a lie that had cost them everything. The war hadn't been lost on the Eastern Front. It was lost in the very homes and schools of Germany, where the nation's greatest resource was told to stay in the kitchen. The old world was gone, burned away by the truth. The new reality was stark and unforgiving. America's most decisive weapon was never a secret. It was its culture. It was the social freedom and pragmatism that allowed it to mobilize its entire population, to transform housewives into welders and farm girls into mechanics. The German soldiers in Camp McCain and across the United States were no longer just defeated warriors. They were living proof of a failed experiment. They were the products of a system that had traded industrial pragmatism for ideological purity, and had been crushed as a result. The initial shock of seeing a woman drive a truck had completed its journey, evolving into a devastating and complete understanding of their defeat. The sight was no longer just surprising, it was now a symbol of everything they had fatally misunderstood. What does it feel like to realize the very foundation of your world was not a rock but sand, and the tide was coming in? When Klaus was finally repatriated in 1946, he returned to a ghost country. The Germany he had left, a nation of proud banners and immaculate order, had been pounded into a grey landscape of rubble and dust. And here he witnessed a final bitter irony. Toiling in the ruins of Berlin, hauling bricks and clearing debris with their bare hands, were the women of Germany. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, were all that stood between total collapse and the first glimmers of reconstruction. They were performing the hardest manual labour, their faces etched with a grim determination that was a world away from the cheerful confidence of the American women he remembered. The sight brought his American education to its brutal conclusion. His nation had shielded its women from the means of production, only to force them to clean up the ruins of its destruction. The American women in their factories and trucks were a symbol of a nation's proactive might, a power so vast it could be casually deployed. The German women in the rubble were a symbol of reactive survival, the last resort of a nation that had been utterly broken. The strength was the same, but one was the cause of victory, the other a consequence of defeat. The story of the stunned German POWs became a footnote in the grand history of the war, but a telling one. It served as an external, unbiased validation of the success of the American home front. These soldiers, raised in the hyper-masculine ideology of the Third Reich, became unwilling witnesses to the power of a different model. Their shock was the measure of America's industrial and social achievement. That mobilization of women, the millions of Rosie the Riveters, did more than just build machines of war. It irrevocably altered the fabric of American society, planting the seeds of second-wave feminism and forever changing the economic landscape. The women who learned to weld, to manage a factory floor, to drive a truck, did not simply forget those skills or the taste of economic independence when the men came home. The German POWs thought they were seeing a temporary wartime anomaly. In reality, they were getting a brief, shocking glimpse into the future of the Western world. A future where the old, rigid divisions of labour were being dismantled. They were the first, unsuspecting audience for a social revolution. In the end, this is a story about a simple, shocking sight. But its universal truth is far more profound. It teaches us that the most dangerous flaw a society can have is a weakness it has mistaken for a strength. The Third Reich believed its rigid social order and its cult of martial masculinity were the bedrock of its power. In reality, this ideology was a cage, a self-imposed limitation that made it brittle, inflexible, and blind. It led them to fatally underestimate an enemy that defined strength not by its adherence to tradition, but by its capacity to adapt, to mobilize, and to unlock the potential of all its citizens. The true arsenal of democracy was never just its factories, it was its pragmatism. It was the revolutionary and deeply American idea that when the work needs to be done, you give the tools to anyone willing and able to do it. The war was won not by the army that was the strongest on paper, but by the society that was deepest in practice. And the German prisoners, staring in disbelief at a woman driving a truck, were the first to learn that the battle for the 20th century had already been lost.